They walked in chains so we don't have to. We often forget the dark cloud of slavery that hung over humanity for an age, and the pioneers that imagined a clearer sky. The forgotten time when millions were not born free. These films are about those dreamers who saw a clearer sky and the dark cloud of slavery that still fogs our modern world. With these series of films, we will explore one of those who imagined a brighter future, publishing a book in 1791 during the height of the transatlantic slave trade. The book was originally called The Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic and Commerce of the Human Species. This is a Therapeutic Productions project. Dark Thoughts Chapter 1, Ottobah Cugano, Early Life and Writings.
The case of Cugano is very, very interesting because he is the first Afro-Briton, let's call him that, to come out and write a book about slavery, write about British imperialism in general. He also comes out and talks about human rights. He is by far and away at the time the most kind of radical figure within the abolitionist movement in Britain.
Even among the profligate adventurers, which were sent to conquer and desolate the New World, there were some persons that retained some tincture of virtue and generosity, and some men of the greatest reputation of both gentlemen and clergy, which did not only remonstrate but protest against these measures and carried on.
Well, we know more about his early life than we do about most people who were enslaved in Africa, but we certainly don't know as much as we'd like. What he tells us is that he was a Fonte in what is present-day Ghana, that he was kidnapped by fellow Africans in around 1770 when he was about 13 years old. And he was sold to English slave traders who brought him across the Atlantic through the Middle Passage to Grenada. And he was there for a couple of years. He was owned by Alexander Campbell, who brought him to England. And at the end of 1772, which was a very significant year to bring an enslaved person from the Caribbean to England, because a few months before Cugano arrived in England, there was the famous Mansfield decision in which Lord Chief Justice Mansfield ruled that any enslaved person brought to England from the colonies could not legally be forced back to the colonies as a slave. Campbell had renamed Cugano John Stewart, and friends of Cugano, John Stewart, had advised him that as a kind of extra security insurance against being sent back to the Caribbean, he should get himself baptized, which he did in 1773, in August of 1773, in St. James Church, Piccadilly. And he was baptized as John Stewart, 16 years old.
So I do think his work is very, very interesting. Also, to learn about the experience of enslaved people from a first hand, I think that's very important. In philosophy, that's called standpoint theory. That says that your own personal experiences shape your perspective on the world. And basically, that's different for everybody. But the case is that in philosophy and in much of academia, actually, the unique perspectives of minorities and oppressed people have been ignored totally or neglected. That's true, for example, about female philosophers. That's definitely true with philosophers of color. We need those kind of ideas, those kind of experiences that I, as a white man, cannot have, per definition, cannot have.
I think for young people, the connection of history, it's connecting the past to the future. And one of the things that, one of the sayings that I've always loved is that if you don't know your past, you don't know where you're going. The thing with history is we're not teaching global history enough. I think young people need to be a bit more aware of not just things that happens locally, but things that happens on a wider field.
Then there's a big gap of about a dozen years, Well, we don't know what's happened to him, but suddenly he becomes, by 1784, he's in the employ of the fashionable painters Richard Cosway and his wife Maria Cosway, and he's living in the Schomburg house, which still exists. There's a plaque on the wall that acknowledges his existence there, and that's on Pall Mall. And we know about him for the next few years because of the association with Cosway, because Cosway was caricatured in both prints and plays, and often with a black servant who was obviously John Stuart Cugano. And we know that Cugano, through Cosway, had connections to the court, because Cosway in 1785 was appointed the official painter to the Prince of Wales. So that's how Cugano got his entry into the fashionable world. So he met the Prince of Wales, obviously, often, but he also later corresponded with the Prince of Wales, with Edmund Burke, with the king himself. He sent letters to. They exist in manuscript, all of which he was doing when he was trying to sell his book. Because in 1787, he published his major work on thoughts and sentiments on the evil and wicked traffic and commerce of the human species, which is a book-length polemic against the transatlantic slavery and actually slavery itself. And this is a very radical work.
There is good reason to suppose that it was far from the intention of Ferdinand, King of Spain, to use his new subject in America in the brutal and barbarous manner that his people did, and happy for the credit of the nation and the honor of mankind.
It actually was interesting because it didn't cause quite a stir. It was, as far as I can tell, it was never reviewed. And we don't know why it was never reviewed. It could be because it was so much more radical than anything else that had been written up until that point about the slave trade and in opposition to the slave trade. In 1791, he published an abridged version of the book in which he included subscribers, the list of subscribers, that is, people who paid in advance for copies of the book. And they included people like Richard Cosway himself, of course, and Sir Joshua Reynolds, the most famous painter of the 18th century, certainly at that time, of the 18th century. So again, it indicates how well connected Cugano was through his employment with Cosway. But still, that book was, even the abridgment was never reviewed.
The book used words like evil and wicked to describe the act of slavery, language rarely used by his contemporaries. Cugano didn't just hope for a better future, he demanded it. His writing stands as a true declaration of freedom.
Sometimes your culture can become embarrassing because it represents something other than the established norm. And you want to fit in. You want to be seen, to have all the badges that represent being part of the wider community. So over the years, I've had people turn around and say to me, "Oh, I don't see you as being black." And I'm thinking, hello, yes, I am black, and I do want you to see me as being black. Why?
Well, we know very little about his life in the Americas, in Grenada, except that he tells us he was there, and that Campbell, his owner, Alexander Campbell, at this time owned hundreds of slaves on various plantations in different colonies, in different islands in the Caribbean, and that he was there for a couple of years, being taken around. He obviously got exposure to some literacy. He was renamed John Stewart, which may indicate that Campbell used him as a steward and exposed him to some education because he would then be more valuable to him as a commodity. But other than that, it's just speculation.
You might think that most of the analysis of slavery happens in the discipline of history, but a lot of it happens as well in philosophy, but also in economics, for example, or in sociology. And so if we bring those perspectives together, only then we will get a really thorough, really comprehensive picture.
As descendants of slaves, it's not always easy to feel connected to our ancestors. So much of our history was lost or twisted, leaving us unsure of where we truly come from. That disconnection can leave you feeling caught between two worlds. Economics is one of the cleanest ways to see how slavery has impacted our culture. After everything our ancestors went through, we've come to understand the value of fair trade and how it can uplift us as people.
So it is a fundamental aspect of human society as it fosters exchange of goods and services. It helps. Through trade, we engage with individuals and understanding the diverse cultures that we find ourselves in. And this promotes innovation, also enriches the diverse cultures that we have. So this is how. So again, you can use international trade as well in how it has benefited our society here in the UK. And
Sharing ideas instead of...
sharing innovations, and yeah. So you'll be surprised that there are equally good innovators in these developing countries that help.
And since that iniquitous traffic of slavery has commenced and been carried on, many gentlemen of the most distinguished reputation of different nations, and particularly in England, have protested and remonstrated against it.
Well, I think he'd see progress, for sure, because, we are free. So that in itself is progress. And what we do have in terms of freedom is the ability to make choices. So I think that's one of the hooks that people, who will look at us and think, well, you've got a choice. You can make that choice to do this or to do that. And then, again, that might cover a multitude of sins and things that have happened in the past. But I'm still saying that with all the progress that we've made, with all the opportunity, I cannot say that I have not had opportunity.
I think he'd be quite proud that he started something and raised the awareness, raised the narrative about being an ex-black slave and why people would do that, why another human being would own another human being. So I think it was good that he raised the narrative then, and I think he'd be pleased with some of the progress that has been made. Because I know I complain, but there has been progress.
I'm determined to say I'm not simply black British, I'm black English. And the reason why I say that is because I feel that if the best you can do is be black British, you're saying to the rest of the world, to be English, you have to be white. And also you're saying to the rest of the world, to be English, not only do you have to be white, but you can only be black British. You're on the outside looking in. You can never get to the heart of Englishness and English culture. And you were talking about integration. And for me, I'm not going to lose my blackness, but I'm going to say I'm English.
Ottobah Kokowano's book, Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of Commerce of the Human Species, nearly faded into obscurity. But his words endured, lighting a torch in the darkness of slavery, leading to familiar echoes throughout history. He saw a clearer sky during the darkest days, when being free was just a dream. Chapter 2, The Slave Trade and Ottobah Kokowano's Perspective. In this chapter, we will explore the contradictory rhetoric surrounding the pro-slavery agenda during the 17th century, and how Ottobah Kokowano used classic rhetoric to dismantle these arguments through his writings. We will also look beyond Cocoano's era, examining the events that eventually led to the fall of the largest forced migration in history. Let's rewind the clock to a time when millions were not born free.
The first enslaved person to arrive in the Americas was around 1522. The Spanish were the first to kind of colonize the Americas. The reason the Spanish started this trend of taking enslaved Africans to the Americas was because labor shortages. Disease had decimated indigenous American populations across the Americas, disease that was taken in ships by Europeans. And so the Spanish first trialed slavery in kind of the West African islands of West Africa, but then there was a concerted effort to replace this lost servile labor with enslaved Africans.
But again, when he draws a comparison of the many hardships that the poor in Great Britain and Ireland labour under, as well as many of those in other countries, that their various distresses are worse than the West Indian slaves. It may be true, in part, that some of them suffer greater hardships than many of the slaves. But bad as it is, the poorest in England would not change their situation for that of slaves, nor as little would a rich man wish to change his situation of affluence for that of a beggar. And so, likewise, no freeman, however poor and distressing his situation may be, would resign his liberty for that of a slave in the situation of a horse or a dog.
That the Spanish introduced contemporaneous slavery that then, of course, was developed into this race-based slavery. They began by enslaving the indigenous people. When that labor market became diminished, mainly because of the diseases that the Europeans had introduced and the really harsh labor that they had forced them to undergo, then they began importing enslaved Africans.
Slavery has always existed in human society. Chattel slavery is very, very different. Chattel slavery is slavery that emerged in the Atlantic slave trade, was perpetual slavery. If you're an enslaved person, your children would have been enslaved perpetually, and their children, and their children, and children. That is not this kind of slavery that existed in ancient Egypt or Roman times or even in West Africa. So there was a change there in terms of long-term enslavement that the Atlantic slave trade entailed.
The indigenous population in Africa were also part of it. You know, they couldn't have been successful if some of us didn't help them, unfortunately. And that is something that we don't like to talk about because it causes a rift between Africans diasporically. Yeah, I remember being young and my parents not asking my parents, whereabouts in Africa do we come from? And they were like, we're not African. Well, how could we not be African? No, we're West Indian. So then there was this ownership, and I think it caused divisions.
These slave procurers are a set of as great villains as any in the world. They often steal and kidnap many more than they buy at first, if they can meet with them, by the way. And they have only their certain boundaries to go to and sell them from one to another so that if they are sought after and detected.
The relationship between Western Europeans and Africans in this period was predominantly over slavery. So enslaved people were taken progressively over the space of 300 years in the bows of slave ships. At the same time, I think it's really important to acknowledge that Africans were also engaged in the Atlantic trade, commercial trade or slave trade, as free people as well. So there were many examples of African pilots on slave trading ships or African sailors on ships that went across to the Americas as well. So it's not only a relationship of slavery that Africans, that we can examine the relationship between Africans and Europeans in the Americas.
As far as we know, he first became involved in it in 1786 when he engaged with another formerly enslaved African to try to save a third African from being forced back to the colonies illegally, at which point he and his friend contacted Granville Sharp, the great abolitionist, white abolitionist Granville Sharp, to intervene, and they successfully did intervene in that case.
Granville Sharp was one of the first white British voices to speak out against the horrors of slavery. His early legal work, particularly the landmark Somerset case of 1772, laid the foundation for the legal and moral challenges that would follow.
This opportunity to be here, someone like me, wouldn't have the opportunity to even go to school, let alone university. So I think he'll be very proud if it was the ancestral world that he has done something significant that has opened the world for the people that he wants to help. And
although I may disagree with certain political positions, I will say that I agree that black people can hold any reasonable political position. Because I'm not going to say that they should have joined the Nazi Party and signed on the dotted line under Hitler and Goebbels and Göring.
But this crafty author has also, in defense of his own or his employers, craft in the British West Indian slavery, giving sundry comparisons and descriptions of the treatment of the slaves in the French islands and settlements in the West Indies and America. Contrary to what is the true case, he would have it supposed that the treatment of the slaves in the former is milder than the latter. But even in this unwarily for his own craft of slavery, all that he has advanced can only add matter for his confutation, and serve to heighten the ardor and wish of every generous mind, that the whole should be abolished. An equal degree of enormity found in one place cannot justify crimes of as great or greater enormity committed in another. The various depredations committed by robbers and plunderers on different parts of the globe may not be equally alike bad, but their evil and malignancy in every appearance and shape can only hold up to view the just observation. And virtue herself has such peculiar mien, vice to be hated, needs but to be seen.
Definitely. So one of the ways in which slavery was legitimized was to say that black people were savage, were uncultured, and needed slavery to be civilized, to be productive members of the world. Well, of course, that's patently false, of course. Yeah. That's real propaganda, real misinformation. But that sort of legitimized slavery for slaveholders and slave owners, etc. And it's then those black philosophers, for example, who really went to the core of those legitimizing myths and told us that they're really not true.
As several people like Malcolm X and Nelson Mandela would tell you, education is a very powerful tool, okay, that would open your own horizon, help you to educate. So there's always saying, if a mom is educated or a dad is educated, it's likely going to have an impact on the children, okay. People have abolitionists like Ottobah use different tactics, political activism, rallies, literal work, to have advocating or to try and stop slave trade.
He uses literary skills to kind of turn the tables on some of the arguments that people who defend slavery use. So one of those principal arguments, and I'd like to talk about that, is at the time, those who support slavery in the British Empire say, well, actually African people, are very much involved in enslaving their own people, right? It's not, Europeans are just buying enslaved people off the West African coast. We're buying them from African middlemen. African people sell their own people into slavery. So
it's an economic treatise. He talks about that the British should start to trade with Africa, not in Africans. They should replace the trade in Africans with the trade with Africa for commodities other than human commodities. No one had done this before.
The ideas and arguments Ottobah Kugano presented in his book helped shift the abolitionist movement into a deeply moral one. His words would go on to inspire other black writers, and his message would cross the oceans, influencing resistance and debate in the Caribbean and Americas.
In his narrative, he says, well, let's think of an example here. What would happen if pirates from West Africa arrived on British shores? They came and, with the help of British merchants in London or Bristol or Liverpool, wherever, and started enslaving thousands and thousands of white British people. What would happen? Would you say that those merchants in Britain, merchants in London or Bristol or Liverpool have no responsibility in this at all? Or would you argue that they are morally responsible for their involvement in the slave trade? And would you say that this is acceptable? So he turns this kind of history on its head here, and he says, well, what would happen if you were in our position, right? Would you say that this is okay just because they're West African middlemen, just like if there were London middlemen involved in the slave trade and we were trafficking you to the Americas?
But such as taking prisoners of war from the neighbours are generally kept in that state until they can exchange and dispose of them otherwise. And towards the West Coast, they are generally procured for the European market and sold. They have the great aversion to murder or even taking away lives, or those which they judge guilty of crimes, and therefore they prefer disposing of them otherwise better than killing them.
I think there was a lot of baggage. The slave trade was massive. It affected millions of people, and I still think the scars are still worn by a lot of us. I know some people want reparation, and every time Prince Charles go anywhere, that's one at the top of the list, but they can't afford to pay it. That would be billions of pounds.
In 1791, Ottobah Cugano was lost to history. Therefore, we may never know if he lived to witness the abolishment of slavery as an institution. He would have been 61 years old.
And I recognise the importance of integration, but there are also the dangers of integration, that people lose themselves in their bid to feel as if they belong.
That's how my parents felt. They just didn't want to go there. And they felt that the Africans that came to England when my parents came in the 50s and 60s looked at us as slaves. And I think that was my mother's thing, that don't call me a slave. She didn't, she felt that she was being belittled a lot of the time. So there were divisions there as well. I think we're closer. I see myself as an African in the diaspora. I've been to Africa. I love it. I just, felt connected. And I think we could do that a bit more. We are all one people at the end of the day.
Prussia, Frederick the Great, ends serfdom in 1782, I believe it is. And in Austria, serfdom is ended a couple of years later. So these are just a few years before he publishes his book. So it seems as if the wave of freedom is, starting to rise. But he's always suspicious because he points out that the British are probably might be making a big mistake in settling these people back into Sierra Leone, because Sierra Leone is a site of enslavement. People are being brought out of Africa enslaved from the area around Sierra Leone. And he actually proved himself to be prescient in that, because the first attempt at the settlement of Sierra Leone was destroyed by Africans, slave traders in the area. That's a whole other story, but he himself applied to be sent to Sierra Leone. As far as we know, that it was never accepted. He also applied, we have a letter in which he asked to be sent to Canada, to Nova Scotia, to help recruit people who had been brought to Nova Scotia with the retreating British Army.
Who began to willingly emancipate their own slaves and kind of see the religious ills of holding slaves. And now those Quakers had a huge influence on Quakers in Britain at the same. In this, we're talking about the mid 1700s here. So you see abolition in the United Kingdom developing among religious, so quote unquote radicals, Quakers, who were considered kind of radical nonconformists. And so it's in religious groups, it's in churches, it's among religious societies that abolition first gets talked about. at least as kind of a political movement. Now, it's important to note here that at the time, at least in Britain, people were not talking about the abolition of slavery per se, but the abolition of the slave trade.
Well, because he's an antecedent for what comes, especially in the 19th century, when you start to have people like Frederick Douglass, most famously in the 19th century, opposing slavery itself, coming out against the institution itself. In the 18th century and into the very early 19th century, the first thing that people have to try to stop is this transatlantic slave trade. Then the second stage is slavery itself.
We tend to dismiss how far we've come socially. It's a bit like Jesse Jackson crying at Obama's inauguration. He couldn't believe how far in his own lifetime that he was able to see a black president. And so someone like Ottobah, he'd be blown away.
While in our modern world, the dark cloud of slavery no longer hovers so explicitly over us, we should not assume we live beneath a clear sky. Slavery continues to fog our contemporary perspective, having deeply influenced our social structures, economics, political systems, and cultural identities. Dark Thoughts. Chapter 3, Philosophy and Religion. He used his words to cut through the propaganda of the slave trade, exposing it as godless rhetoric. The sword Ottobah so proudly wielded was his unwavering devotion to Christianity. Having been baptized at 16, yet he did not strike so recklessly. Instead, he employed philosophy and motivational language to persuade the British public to see the truth as he did. Let's turn back the pages to a time when religious thinking dominated the political landscape.
But this will appear evident to all men that believed in the scriptures, that every reason necessary is given that they should be believed, and in the case that they offered us the information that all mankind did spring from the original, that there are no different species among men. God who made the world have made of one blood all the nations of men that dwell on the face of the earth. Wherefore we may justify infer, as there are no inferior species, but all of one blood and of one nature.
The book itself is a Jeremiah because he positions himself very much like the Old Testament Jeremiah, who issues a warning to his people, in this case to the people of Great Britain, that if they don't change their ways, they're going to be cursed and doomed. And in fact, he quotes Jeremiah as the last quotation in his book, and his book is full of quotations from the Old and New Testament, because he's like an Old Testament voice. He's issuing this, it's essentially a long sermon, you might say. This is one of the reasons why there's a lot of repetition in the book, that if we try to read it, it's not like a novel, but he includes a lot of different things in it. There's a history in it, the history of slavery he includes in it.
Throughout history, many minorities, let's say, have been ignored or neglected a little bit, like non-Western philosophy, but also feminist philosophy and female philosophers. And so that was the case during the Enlightenment period as well, I think. Although it is important to know that it was black thinkers like Iguiano and Cugano who emphasized that, in the West, the focus was on liberty and freedom, while at the same time there was slavery happening in the rest of the world, basically.
Well, in his own person and his own writings, he demonstrates the potential of people of African descent, that anyone like James Tobin that I mentioned earlier, or David Hume, who doubt the potential of people of African descent. Here he is right in their face, saying, okay, look what I can do. I'm steeped in the Bible. He doesn't simply repeat the Bible, he adopts the Bible, he conflates Old Testament and New Testament verses in his epigraph that begins his book. And he adopts a biblical voice. At various points, he addresses his readers as "O ye," as if he's speaking from the Old Testament. He's demonstrating how much he has learned.
But the prediction and curse rested wholly upon the offsprings of Canaan, who settled in the land known by his name, in the West Asia. As in evident from the sacred writings, the Canaanites became an exceeding wicked people and were visited with many calamities, according to the predictions of Noah, for their abominable wickedness and idolatry. Now the descendants of the other 3 sons of Ham were not included under the curse of his father. And as they dispersed and settled on the different parts of the earth, they became also sundry distinct and very formidable nations. Cush the oldest settled in the southwest of Arabia, and his descendants were anciently known to the Hebrews by his name of Cushites. One of his sons, Nimrod, founded the kingdom of Babylon in Asia, and the others made their descent southward by the Red Sea, and came over to Abyssinia and Ethiopia, and likely dispersed themselves throughout all the southern and interior parts of Africa.
They stood as examples of radical, intelligent black men, which really kind of pushed against the stereotype that a lot of people at the time had of African and black people in general, which was that they weren't capable of this sort of intellectual curiosity and thinking, especially in the case of Cugano. His work goes far beyond just the issues of slavery. He deals with human rights, he deals with the question of imperialism, and in many senses he's actually writing about issues that some white European thinkers, intellectuals are not talking about at the time, and stuff that's only kind of revisited. The history of imperialism, something within Britain that's only really revisited in earnest after the British Empire collapses post Second World War, right? 150 years later, then Cugano is actually writing about this issue.
Just undertone. In fact, he ends with kind of catechism of he shifts from addressing Africans, fellow Africans, to addressing fellow Britons, because he has this dual identity in which he takes advantage of, because he positions himself as a kind of stranger in a strange land, which again goes back to the biblical context, in which he can observe the British from the outside. He's like an inside outsider, outside insider. So he switches his positions as he thinks is appropriate, because he's very rhetorically aware of what he's trying to do.
We are very much part of a global community now. Travel, not only our young people going abroad, but young people and other people coming to us. And in order for us to understand culture, we need to understand history. We need to know where we're coming from, where people are coming from, and what makes humanity. Because I think at the moment we're missing a little bit on the humanity side. And I think that comes from a lack of understanding, a lack of appreciation, a lack of empathy for what other people experience.
It's very typical for those writers like Cugano and Equiano to use those Western concepts of rights and freedoms and what they've read in the Western world and what they've seen in the UK when Cugano was in England, for example, and to apply that to the African context. But I do find it very important that he emphasizes that human rights are universal values, individual freedoms are universal values, the equality of people should be extended to include people of color as well. Now we take that more or less for granted in the intellectual world at least, but back then that was quite controversial.
The justification given to the need or the reason why African people were enslaved very much comes down to kind of religious justification here. Now, European thinkers and intellectuals and religious figures really had to scramble here to find biblical justifications for slavery. And they did so through several Old Testament, several stories in the Old Testament. Principally, the one is of the punishment of Ham, in which Ham is cast out as a sinner, and there is some sort of association there, at least, even though it's not mentioned in the text, that his skin was dark. And so, based on that one little fact, that became one of the principal justifications for racialized slavery, enslavement of African and darker skinned people?
Well, race in the 18th century is much more complex than it is in the 19th century that we're more familiar with. Because in the 18th century, most people at least had to give lip service to the biblical basis for the origin of mankind, which is monogenesis. That's the nice big word for it. The notion that all of us descended from Adam and Eve. One monogenesis, one beginning. It's only in the 19th century that you really have developed the polygenesis, this notion that different humans descended from different origins, which enables the argument for that there's supposedly an inferior group of humans. This is pseudoscientific racism that really comes up in the 19th century. It's very hard to argue that in the 18th century. So cugano really plays hard into that notion that we're all commonly descended from Adam and Eve. And the only difference between us is complexion.
I think it's more interesting to see that he uses Western concepts against the West. So there was a lot of hypocrisy basically in Europe back then. The focus was on enlightenment and reasoning, rationality, and on liberty and freedom, but only applied to white people. And that's just hypocritical. All men are equal, especially if they're white, right? And if you're black or of color, then you're not as equal as white people. Yeah. And so it's, I think, the achievement of Equiano and Cugano and other writers to point out that hypocrisy and to say, look, if you think that all men are equal, then that will include black people as well.
Mm-hmm. They're setting a tradition, both literary tradition of writing about slavery, and because it's really important. I mean, it's really important because these books become, especially the case of Equiano, less so with Cugano, but Equiano, these books are reprinted across both sides of the Atlantic. Equiano's narrative is reprinted in the United States. It's something that's read by both black and white activists and anyone, black and white people, anyone who's literate. So they set off kind of a trend of mass storytelling from a kind of an African perspective.
Whether scientific or religious, the belief that some human beings are inherently superior has lingered throughout history, often sealed tightly within its own perspective. Ottobah, however, stood between two worlds, as a black man from Africa who was once enslaved, and as a British philosophical thinker who was a devout Christian. He would go on to draw from both identities, construct his arguments with clarity and depth.
Where we might call him cautious is the way he talks to the British, because he sees them as a greater hope than, say, the French, of course, who were terrible to the British in the 18th century. They had helped the American revolutionaries defeat the British in the recent war. So obviously they're bad, but they're not as bad as the Spanish, who were the worst, because they started slavery into North America, into the colonies. But he's cautious in that he's trying to convince the British people to support the anti-slavery movement. So he refers to them repeatedly as the noble British, noble Britons. The king is this wonderful person of that we can reside our hopes and trust in. So while he's saying these horrible things are going to happen to you, like some horrible things have already happened to you, even worse will happen to you if you don't straighten up. But you are the guys who we have the greatest chance for because you have the most potential.
The history of African philosophy is very varied, and I mean, it's not a monolithic block. It's not just one single philosophy. It's many traditions, many also very indigenous traditions often. A lot of ancient philosophy happened in Africa, for example, ancient texts in Egypt, or like the intellectual movement in Timbuktu, when it was a real trade center and intellectual center of that part of the world.
We know about the missionaries and Christianity being taken into Africa, into India, and so on. But it didn't come with freedom. It came with control. So I don't understand that. If you're going to preach religion, then surely you would preach it with freedom and not enslavement.
But I mean, even like the biblical justifications were incredibly tenuous. Like there's nothing in the Old Testament that says that Ham was actually dark-skinned or black. That is something that was kind of put in much, much later. So you have people scrambling here looking at the Old Testament, even though the New Testament, the Bible, talks about Christianly far more kind of universalist, humanistic kind of behavior. People pick and chose really the bits of the Old Testament that they wanted to use to justify. And that's both Catholics and kind of Protestants, as I've said already.
Century, because slavery is not condemned outright in the Bible. Certainly not in the Old Testament, and not even in the New Testament. The New Testament, there's never a statement that slavery is absolutely evil, because slavery was a recognized status in the times of the New Testament. The argument was that you should treat all people as, all fellow Christians particularly, as equals. And of course, spiritually, we're all equal.
Obviously, these slave masters, they owned you, didn't they? And to think you can own another human being, as you said, if you're a Christian, why would you own another human being, telling them what to do, when they do, and work them to the ground? I think that was a really good point that he made.
I also think the emphasis on that equality is universal. It matters for Western people, white people, but for people of color as well. I think we take that intellectually for granted.
But it's when people don't want to have a healthy conversation. And part of the problem we have in British society is so much of what we do is adversarial. So PMQs in Parliament, rather than Labour or Conservative having a conversation, it's who can score points, land the knockout punch. And it's the same with the law. Prosecution and defence, they're always trying to outmaneuver each other, rather than let's have a conversation to see how close we can get to an agreement and to what we consider to be the truth.
Christianity in the hands of the self-serving was used to justify the enslavement of millions, but in the hands of the courageous became a force to protect humanity and expose the evils of slavery. Ottobah dismantled religious zealotry from within the faith itself, demonstrating what a true Christian looks like, someone whose words are backed by action. In the final part of this series, we will explore the slavery economy that propelled Western dominance in the modern world, and the ethical systems that surrounded and sustained it. In this chapter, we'll explore how the ethics of the 1500s led to the forced migration of millions of people, shifting the global economy into a network that closely resembles our modern economy. There was, however, one key difference: racial exploitation. Let's take a look under the hood of the economy that propagated the treatment of human beings as property.
Relationship between West Africa or West Central Africa and Europe has not always been one of subjugation, right? When Europeans first sailed to West Africa in the 1400s, they traded with people, right? So their interactions there weren't necessarily one of violence, of subjugation, it was trade. When slavery became racialized, when this idea of a slave being an African or a black person happened, that's kind of when the relationship between Western Europeans and Africans changed entirely, right?
Ethics shapes our society, government, and of course trade. For instance, supplying goods and services, and also it promotes economic growth. So you can take an example is where fair trade produce are in our supermarkets, for instance. What does it do? It promotes trade from the developing world to the developed world. where certain amount of money is allocated for this produce. Okay, that's why you go to the market, you see fair trade. And these are a clear example of ethics.
A very tough sell because part of it's an economic sell. You know, the British are making a lot of money from the transatlantic slave trade. The British are importing he even addresses the fact that they're putting all the sugar in the coffee. He says, ending the slave trade, yeah, it might raise the price of sugar a little bit for your coffee, but you know, it's worth it. It's worth it for your conscience and for your souls and for your chance in an afterlife.
Issue with labor, I think is at the front of this ethic issue, in that people use very cheap labor in buying very cheap goods and selling it at a very astronomical prices. Labor is at the heart of it, and we need to find a way to navigate around this, which is why certain goods are not purchased in some countries or some part of the world, essentially because of the issue of labor.
History can be cruel to those who do not hold a pen. That's why Ottobah Kokowano's work is so important. He held his own pen, and through his writing offered a perspective unlike any other.
Now, if integration means that everyone has to speak in a perceived pronunciation manner, then I'm not too sure if integration is that helpful. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't give a little and take a little. Of course we should. And I understand what integration is all about. And I recognize the importance of integration.
It's belief, values, and feelings. They need to know how the world works so that they know where they fit in the world. And it's a good development for people that they know about other cultures. Cultural awareness, I think, is very important because it leads to understanding of people. If I understand your culture, I'd more understand you as a person. So I think humanities is about the world, about thinking about yourself, how you fit in that world as well, and what you can do as a person to be a valued member of the community. So I think history and humanity, they go kind of hand in hand. And I think it's important that people know where they're from and, you know, about other people as well in the world. I think is very important.
But again, in answer to another part of the pretense which the favourers of slavery makes use of in their defence, that slavery was an ancient custom, and it became the prevalent and universal practice of many different barbarous nations for ages. This must be granted, but not because it was right, or anything like right and equity.
We want young people to integrate with each other. Then do we want them to separate? And I'm trying to work out here. So for me, I think that knowledge of self is empowering. And from that position, if you understand who you are and your history and so on, then you start making the choices that you want to move forward. But they don't know themselves. No one is talking about that. So it's like they just popped up. Well, where did you come from? How did you get here? You know, that sort of thing.
Issue of people buying these goods, okay? People want cheap goods, essentially, yeah? I've learned this through my studies that even the richest, they want a bargain, okay? And so this also breed these unethical behaviors among countries. And I think we should look into ourselves and see, are we paying the right prices for the right products and services?
They need to be loved. They need to have boundaries. They need to have father figures. They need to have friends that will tell them that's wrong. I think there's still a lot to do. And
many young black men will tell you that there's not a criminal bone in their body, but they are targeted, they are stopped, and they are searched. And they get angry because of that institutionalized way of looking at things. And that is the real problem.
We talked about Africa. Africa, they've got a lot of the communities or culture, they've got their own language. When a lot of the West Indies, it's all English. Like, I don't speak another language apart from Patois, which maybe between Jamaicans we'd probably understand each other, but I think there's no identity. When you've got a language, like you've got a language, different language, you've got an identity, a culture, a tradition.
Western governments did a very poor job of integrating formerly enslaved people into society, into the economy. In the British Empire, at least, after slavery was abolished in 1834 to 1838, there was what was called an apprenticeship period, in which formerly enslaved people had to work for their former masters. They were supposedly required to learn new trades, to learn how to integrate into society as free people. In reality, what happened was that the conditions of slavery were continued. They were still overworked. They were still beaten, punished. And when the apprenticeship period ended in 1838, they were essentially left to their own devices in many ways. So formerly enslaved people were left without land. They were left without jobs. So many of them faced the difficult choice of having to just go back and work for their former enslavers. Others decided to migrate to cities. So if we talk about, let's say, for example, one of the most important British colonies at the time in the Caribbean was Jamaica, many people working on sugar plantations who had formerly been enslaved on sugar plantations decided to migrate to cities like Kingston and face the prospect of very little kind of economic opportunity.
They were left with no money, land, or resources, and they were forced to work for the very people they had enslaved them. While they were technically free, there was no infrastructure ready to support them. The road to equality was a long and difficult journey.
Today, Donald Trump is being inaugurated.
Yes.
And he's a perfect example of why history is important. If you look at elements of the far right, they recognize that the person who holds the pen that writes the history has the power. And they are terrified of anything that wants to rewrite a history or correct a history from what they already know.
I think there should be some kind of reparation for those who suffered slave trade. A reparation because this still is in the heart and mind of people. People are still traumatized when they read this. People get anger.
If you understand your bias and prejudices, you will make a better decision, and I think you would understand people and accept people, to accept their differences, because we all got different.
I just feel that, if we could not think as slaves, if we can acknowledge what happened, but think about the progress and how we're moving forward, that would be great. But I think that we need some help with that. And in England right now, I don't think that they're being very honest about it. I don't think that they want to acknowledge. And I think that's really, really sad. Yeah. In fact, I'm angry about that.
I think it's important, like what Operation Black Vote was trying to do, is to get different people in different places in the organisation. Because if people, the community see that, they'll have a lot more faith in those institutions, like the police. If there's more black police officers, more black senior officers, they'll have more faith in the system. If they see more black magistrates, more black judges, they will have a lot more faith in, and some of them might not rebel, because like if a black youth is stopped and searched, they're going to think, oh, I'm going to be handcuffed and carted off to the police station. And they don't have any trust in the police, and trust is a big issue. And even law-abiding citizens like myself, I've been stopped by the police and treated badly, and I had to report them to Croydon police station, because I said, this police officer, she kind of shouted at me.
Cugano was more radical than anyone else had been, because one of the things that he says is that the appropriate punishment for enslavers is to be enslaved themselves by their former slaves. And you can't get much more radical than that. And he was the only person who took that position that I'm aware of. So you might call him the kind of Malcolm X to the Martin Luther King position in his day. And that may be one of the reasons that he was never reviewed. Maybe because he was so radical that reviewers didn't want to give him any wider exposure than that.
At least with overt racism, dare I say, you know where you are, you know where you stand. With structural racism, you look at everyone suspiciously, you never really know what's going on in their heads. And unfortunately, with the damage of overt racism, you're continuously suspicious.
People are working on how slavery and how we tackled slavery, how that will help us with nowadays problems, like, for example, climate change. For example, slave labor was very much entrenched in the economy of the 18th century and, well, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, while fossil fuels are very much entrenched in today's economy. And still we see that we overcame slavery, at least to some extent. We abolished it, the transatlantic slave trades, while nowadays it seems very difficult to tackle our fossil fuel dependency, but if we can learn something from how we tackled slavery, it might be instructive.
A lawful servitude was always necessary and became contingent with the very nature of human society. But when the laws of civilization were broken through, and when the rights and properties of others were invaded, that brought the oppressed into a kind of compulsive servitude, though often not compelled to it by those whom they were obliged to serve. This arose from the different depredation and robberies which were committed upon another.
We didn't understand other cultures. They didn't understand us. Even though we went to a very local mixed school, it wasn't great. No. It wasn't great. We called each other names. We were made to feel small and less than. And there were other cultures that were made to feel that way as well. At times, I remember having to run because I'd seen some skinheads and they were shouting stuff at us and it was like, run, and having to do all of that stuff when I was younger. But I think as we've progressed through maybe emigration, we are enjoying other people's cultures like food, like music, going on holiday. Who stays here anymore? Everybody wants to go on holiday. You want to go somewhere exotic. So I think that there's a lot more integration. There is more respect. I still think we've got some way to go. And I think politically we need to be honest and accept that we're not there yet. So let's not pretend that we're there yet. We still have to work on it.
With African, Black, and related ethnic minority groups is we forget about that variety and we try to create a homogenous group as if everyone is walking in the same direction, everyone has the same views.
And, for myself as a Black woman, I think of myself as an African in the diaspora. The reason I can say that is because I understand the history. I feel that with that connection of my past, there's a sense of pride that I know that I stand on the shoulders of giants, and therefore I want to do that history proud.
He dared to question the ethics of the powerful, the virtues of the British people, and the contradictions within society. Ottobah teaches us to tell our story, even in the face of impossible opposition. This series follows the story of Ottobah Cugano, a man from the 18th century who lived during the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. While today we may be called free, the dark cloud of slavery has merely been replaced with a fog, surrounding and blinding us to the injustices that have lingered long since the abolishment of slavery. The Southern Hemisphere remains under the heel of the North, exporting raw materials on unequal terms. How do you think your coffee got so cheap? We may be free to work, but artificial austerity has created systems in which we are incentivized to exploit workers, forced to work long hours for less. That sweater you're wearing, how do you think it was made? And the irony of the so-called free market, many of the richest companies in the world profited off the backs of slavery. Back then it was sugar and now it's cobalt. This is how the battery in your phone was made. We could take the easy option and ignore the issues plaguing our modern world, or we can take a page from Ottobah book and be daring enough to challenge the status quo. This is a series made in collaboration with Therapeutic Productions and JV8 Studios.
I'm a true warrior, angel in disguise. Only fire me upon slavery. Only fire me upon slavery. Prison bars are falling. Prisoners rejoicing. Prison bars are falling. Prisoners rejoicing. Soul survivor, taken from Africa with the art of a lion. Fierce as a tiger. Soul survivor, taken from Africa with the art of a lion. Fierce as a tiger. Burning and burning and burning up. Burning and burning and burning up. Soul survivor, taken from Africa with the art of a lion. Fierce as a tiger.